gals. I hope you're doing well tonight. We are starting to look at chapter 5 tonight. So if you're just logging on, this is our live teaching session for 1 Timothy chapter 5. And I have to let you know, I almost didn't make it at 7 o'clock. We are, for some reason, everything just sort of, I don't know if this happens to you ladies, but it just sort of all starts happening. Life starts happening at like, I don't know, 6:45. Like we're throwing dinner together. We're, trying to get the dogs taken care of. So it was a little bit of a close call for me to even get on at 7. So I'm glad that we're here. I'm glad we're getting started. So as you pop on, let me know that you're here. I want to know that the comments are working. I want to know that you can hear me, that everything's going okay on my end so that we don't get too far down the road and have to back up. So let me know. But I hope that you're enjoying 1 Timothy as much as I have been enjoying it. 1 Timothy is really a rich book, and there are so many truths that we can draw from. When I started putting this study together, I really was putting it together just from my own personal devotions, what I'd been studying in the mornings, and just the truths that God had been showing me. And it was rich for me personally because very often, especially if you've grown up in church, sometimes you get a little lazy, a little spiritual lazy. And so I was kind of shocked as I went through the book of 1 Timothy, things I thought that I had settled in my mind or in my heart, and God used some of those truths to reveal to me, no, you need to go back and you need to work on some of that stuff. And so it's been rich for me. And so as you pop on, let me know that you're here. Put a comment on there and let me know who my viewers are. But I'm real interested to know if the study has been as helpful and as rich for you as it has been for me walking through it. I'm continuing to go on and to go in my morning devotions with 1 Timothy, with 2 Timothy, and then my goal is to keep going on into Titus. And so my expectations for those books, because these books are grouped together, are sort of the same. So I want to hear from you. I want to hear if there's something in our studies that God has really drawn your heart to impress on you, to convict you of something, to challenge you, maybe just to comfort you or free you of something. I see some ladies. Hey, Gay. Hi, Miss Kim. So good to see you, ladies. I'm so glad that you're here. So yeah, pop on and let me know if there's a specific truth in 1 Timothy, not just in chapter 5, but as you've read this week, but just in general in the course of our studies, because I want to know if this book has been as rich for you and your spiritual growth as it has been for me going through it. But sometimes when we read a book like 1 Timothy, we kind of get stuck in this rut of thinking that it only has to do with those things that women can't do, or things that they shouldn't be doing in the church or in the home. And I hope that by the end of our time together, you see that is not entirely what 1 Timothy is about, that there is so much that Paul says in regard to women and what they should be doing and things that are there to challenge us. So there really is so much more in 1 Timothy than just those limitations, just those that one restriction that we hear about in 1 Timothy chapter 2. And so that's my hope, that you really have been challenged by this study. So as you're popping on, let me know what your thoughts are and how that's encouraged you. And then as other ladies watch the replay, then they'll be able to see your comments and to say, oh, okay, God spoke to me in the same way, or gosh, God spoke to me in a completely different way. But it's encouraging to see what other ladies are learning as we go along together. So hop on and let me know. But I also wanted to say thank you before we get started for praying for some of the other ladies that are in this group with us. There are some women that are part of my church here in Chattanooga, Angie Waters and Donna Dunlevy, and they are a part of this online study that we've been doing. So you have been praying for them. I posted that in I guess maybe a couple of weeks ago. They were, and they are still, in Honduras. These ladies take a couple of weeks out of their vacation schedule every year, and they go back to Honduras and they pour into the women there. They pour into the churches, the pastors there. Our entire church does. And So thank you for praying for them. I have seen updates that have come through about what God has been doing through them and through our church's efforts there. And it's been really amazing to hear so many people being fed physically, because there's a high percentage of poverty there. And so there's so many people getting fed. There's so many people getting fed spiritually. There have just been hundreds of professions of faith. And they go back every year to make sure that those individuals continue to go on to be discipled. But these ladies do this. And, who has 2 free weeks of vacation? Very few of us, but yet that is sort of the measure of their heart, that they choose to sacrifice in that way. And so thank you for praying for them. Keep praying for them. They have 1 more week. Hi, Caroline. How are ya? You doing good? Did you get your kids all fed? I barely got mine fed. I mean, I made fish tonight, so my house stinks so bad. I'm so glad you guys can't smell what's going on in my house. But, you gotta get your peoples fed. So, pop on and let me know what the studies in 1 Timothy have meant to you guys and what you've been learning. And then thank you for praying for the ladies. It means so much. And it's so exciting to be able to participate with people who live on the opposite side of the country, but we get to partner in that same work. The church is not a building. The church is the body of Christ. And that doesn't include just your one little church that you attend, but it encompasses all of the church's congregations everywhere that are redeemed by Christ. So that's pretty exciting that we get to partner in that way. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to go through and I want to start in chapter 5. And ladies, chapter 5 is so rich. I'm so excited. There are so many things that we'll talk about tonight that I think will really challenge you. So I'm excited. I want to dig in, but in the event that there are women who watch this on the replay and they've never watched one of our live teaching sessions before, I'm still getting requests to be approved to join the group. So there's new ladies that are joining. So if you are new to this or you watch this on the replay, here's what you can expect from tonight. I am just going to walk through the chapter 5 in 1 Timothy. And I will walk through and we'll just read it verse by verse. And I'll just kind of give you a heads up in in chapter 5. I'm not really going to spend a lot of time on the end of the chapter. I'm going to spend the bulk of my time in the beginning and the middle parts that deal specifically with women. Not that the end is not important. It's just this is where I really feel like God is calling me to kind of camp out. And so we, for the most part, in our time together in our live teaching sessions, will walk through a chapter, verse by verse, just to help you be able to understand what you've been reading during the week, check sort of some of the things that you've been studying if you're using the study sheets. And then that way you can really get a good sense and have a deeper study about what Paul was really telling the church and then how that applies to us today. So I want to dig in and I want to start. And I want to start just by reading and looking at the first 2 verses of chapter 5. Because in those first 2 verses, Paul is really going to lay out the framework for how we're supposed to understand the rest of the chapter 5. And he's going to establish a principle that's going to really help us interpret what's to come so that we don't get stuck, okay? So let's look at chapter 5, and let's look at verses 1 and 2, and we'll read them together, and don't forget, I'm reading in the New King James Version. And as you pop on, just let me know that you're here and that you can hear me, and let's get started. Okay, verse 1 in chapter 5, Paul starts off and he says this to Timothy, who he has left in Ephesus to pastor the church there. He says, "Do not rebuke," and that word rebuke means, harshly correct. It has, in the original language, like tense, like an implication of violence. So do not, harshly rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father, Paul says, but exhort him as a father. And that word exhort is the exact opposite of that word rebuke. It has this connotation of coming near to someone who is weaker, in a sense of correction, but also in just comforting someone. And so Paul says to Timothy, don't rebuke those harshly that are older, but exhort them as a father. And then he says this, do the same for others. Exhort younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and then younger women as sisters, he says, with all purity. And so this is the framework that's going to help us unpack the rest of the chapter. Paul says that God's house is to basically function as a family. Now, when we come to Christ, we aren't just, forgiven of our sin, but we are adopted into God's family. That's the goal of our adoption, is to restore us back into a relationship with our Creator, who is our spiritual Father. And when that happens to us, we aren't just individual little kids running around on the planet, but we join the family of God. And so that means that the people that are a part of your church, if they have been redeemed by Christ, if they have been adopted into his family, you are to view them as your spiritual brothers, your spiritual sisters. And if they're older than you, as your spiritual fathers and mothers even. And the very practical application of this principle is that we treat others with honor. And we do so not just because of who they are, but because they are now related to our Father, to our spiritual Father in heaven, our Heavenly Father. And so the application is that we are required to honor those that are in the church. Now, this is huge, especially for women, and especially for women in the day and the time in which Paul wrote, that first century Greco-Roman culture. Because in that day, and pretty much it hasn't changed, ladies, but women are so often viewed as objects of pleasure, right? They are viewed in ways in which God did not design for them to be viewed or to be treated. And so when Paul puts sort of this framework together for understanding this chapter, he is making sure that every group, and particularly women, because we'll see what comes next in this chapter, are treated and elevated to the status in which God treats women, and the status and the dignity with which God intended for women to be treated as mothers and as sisters with all purity. And so God's house is to function as a real family. And listen, for some of us who have come from a family that does not know anything of Christ's love, we might think of a family and the word honor does not come to our mind. Maybe more like Jerry Springer comes to mind, but that is not so for God's design. That God's design for the church is to function as a healthy family that honors one another. Okay, so there's no long-term family feuds, right? There's no airing of dirty laundry gleefully. Sometimes you see that in families, and that's not to be the case. There's not to be some dysfunction, but it's the principle of being governed by honor, and you honor others above yourself. And the basic deal is, if you really honor God in your heart, that's your heart, that's going to spill out in the way that you honor other people. It will. And the reverse is true, that if you dishonor others in the way that you treat them and view them and respond to them, then you will be, it's the same thing as dishonoring God, because we are a part of his family in which he is the head. And so that's the dynamic that frames how we understand what follows in chapter 5. And it governs everything else. And that truly is pretty much the framework for 1 Timothy in general. That everything in our life is governed by whether our heart truly honors God above all. Right? You got me? Okay, let me see. Ladies, as you join in, let me know that you're here, because I can see some of y'all, but I don't want to miss anybody, okay? So let me know. Hop on, leave me a comment. Let me know what you've been reading in 1 Timothy that God's really used to just kind of just blow your mind, challenge you, convict you, free you of something, a misconception. I want to know, and I think it will encourage other ladies to see what God is teaching you and what God is doing through your studies, all right? So let us know. Hop on and let me know. Let me make sure. Hey, Beck, how are you? I'm so glad you're here. All right, so let's keep going, because this is the next two sections are where I really want to camp out tonight, because it has so much to say about women. Ladies, there are things in this chapter that we are desperate to hear, okay? So let's keep going, because in the next section, Paul will tell us, not only does God tell us that the house of God needs godly families, people that know how to honor each other above themselves, but that God's house is in desperate need of godly women, okay? Godly women. And so let's read the next section, and let's look at verse 3. Oh, Beck, you're in Australia. I'm so glad you're enjoying this study. You know, I got to travel to Australia once, and it was one of my favorite trips. Man, God's handiwork is on full display there. You got a nice home, lady. Okay, so let's start looking at in verse 3 and read along with me, okay? All right. So Paul says, because you're supposed to be honoring each other as a family, he says this in verse 3, honor widows who are really widows. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home, or show godliness is what the ESV says, to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. And then he says in verse 5, now she who is really a widow and left alone trusts in God, got my notes here, trust in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. And we'll explain all this, but I want to treat this one section as one unit. Verse 7, and these things command that they may be blameless. Not perfect, but blameless, okay? Above reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his own, meaning his own family, and especially those of his household, meaning he's not honoring his household in the way that he needs to be honoring, and that essentially dishonors God, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever, Paul says. And so that family of dynamic that Paul had established in verses 1 and 2 of honor continues into these verses. And it ensures that widows, women who truly are widows, are treated with honor, and they do not fall through the cracks, and they are not marginalized, but they receive that honor and dignity that is due them. Now, in the first century, becoming a widow looked a little bit different than it does today. In the first century, if you were a widow, you were truly in poverty. Very often, women were barred from having any form of employment outside of the home, and so that meant that they, without a husband and without a means of income, had no way to pull themselves up out of poverty. And this was particularly true if they did not have children. If they did not have a male heir through whom would pass all of the lands and all of the inheritance that would come to that family, because that was the line of inheritance. And so if a widow did not have a family, did not have children, particularly male children, then her condition, it was a crisis. And so Paul is saying that the church, it is the church's duty, because it's our duty to honor God, and so we got to treat all of the people in the church with honor, to treat widows with the honor that is due them, and we must provide for them. And that word honor means to support financially. It's not just to pay respect, but to support them financially, and that was a part of the church. Now today, can be the same story, that often women struggle at the loss of their husband, and they struggle in several ways, in many ways. But at least in this culture, there's some different mechanisms by which a woman may not always be thrust into poverty like she was in the first century. Whether it's, savings plans or government assistance, or which, it's not an apples to apples comparison, obviously, but I want you to understand the degree to which God is laying out provisions for women, and for women to be elevated to dignity and to be protected. And so Paul says, honor them, especially those that are childless without any income. But for those who do have some sort of ability to provide for themselves and some sort of income, Paul says that they should not be added to this list to receive physical, substantial support, but instead they should focus on their families, to do so in showing piety and godliness. And so, ladies, when we went through chapter 2 in 1 Timothy, we already talked about how, God's desire for the home plays such an important role in the church's ability to be able to fulfill its mission, that God's design for the church depends on godly homes. And so when we see Paul say that a woman needs to make sure that she is focused and demonstrating godliness there, that is something that is necessary for the church to be able to function in the way that it needs to be able to function, to remain healthy. But those that would be receiving support specifically, Paul is going to lay out some additional, let's call them some qualifications. And I think this is very interesting because what's happening here is these women who were added to this list for financial support or enrolled, some translations say that they were enrolled in the number or the list. I think the ESV is the list. My New King James says the number. That what was happening is that these ladies weren't just receiving physical or substantial financial support, but what they were doing is that they were serving as in a leadership position among other women. They were providing some form of oversight over other women, perhaps over other widows, perhaps over younger widows, and specifically orphans. And so what they were doing really mirrors very closely those admonitions that Paul continues to give about women discipling women training other women, and you see it in places like Titus 2. But these women were elevated to a position of leadership, and so that's why Paul is very picky about who is to be added to this list. Not just, if they're older, not if they were above the age of 60, but he goes through and he lists that they must also be godly women. And he describes in verses 1 through 8 what these godly women looked like. And then he describes in verses 9 and 10 what these godly women should be doing in order for them to be qualified to receive that, financial help and to then in turn pledge that they would pledge to be devoted to those good works that we see are necessary. And so then Paul says this, that he says, and if you look at the first part of, what a godly woman truly looks like in verses 1 through 8, he says first that godly women, we know they're godly because they're alive. They're alive and not just breathing, right? Not just surviving. He says, but alive. Look at verses 5 because this really provides the clue to what he's saying. He says, now she who is really a widow, left alone, trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. And so godly women are alive, and that means that they are living that life that God intended for them to live, that abundant life, that they are most importantly demonstrating that life in their trust. In their trust, they trust in God, and that trust is a hope. It's a joyful and confident expectation that yes, God is who he says he is, and he is going to do what he has promised that he is going to do in our lives and in the church's life, particularly in reference to salvation. Now, sometimes, and this is where, you don't have to be a Greek scholar to be able to reap truth or to mine the truth from the scriptures, but this is where sometimes the Greek is very helpful, okay? Because it will provide some insight into really what Paul was intending to convey, what the author was really trying to convey. So that word trust is written in a very interesting verb tense. It's not just, a tense to signal past or present action, but it's written in the perfect tense. And in the perfect verb tense, it signified that there was an action that took place at some point in the past, but instead of just stopping there, it continues into the present and on in to the future. And so for a woman who trusts in God, she does not just trust in a one-time event in her past. She does not just, at some point make a profession of faith and then go along her merry way. But her trust is an intentional act. It is a continual act, and it travels through every single day of her life. That is the nature of a godly woman, that she trusts wholeheartedly in who God is and what God says that he is going to do. It's a daily thing, and it's manifested, Paul says, in her faithfulness in prayer. And she continues in prayers night and day, he says. And night, interestingly, is first there. The night in that, that's when the loneliness sets in, right? In the darkest moments. And you can imagine that as a widow in the first century, with all that came with it, that loss was magnified when she was completely and utterly alone. But yet she continues in her faithfulness to pray. And that word continue means to cleave or to hold fast. And you get this picture of a woman who is just so faithful to continually cling to those promises of God that he has given her. It is truly a picture of a heart that is faithful and a heart that is oriented completely and utterly around God. God rules her heart, not fear, not worry for where the next meal is going to come, not concern for her future, but he rules her heart, not her circumstances, not anything else that the world may throw. And ladies, that's life. Drawing near to the Father, that is life. And so a woman who is godly is going to be alive. But ungodly women are the exact opposite, okay? Look at verse 6. Paul says, but she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. Dead while she lives, okay? So I have boys in my house, and automatically I'm already thinking of The Walking Dead. They don't watch that show, but you know what I'm saying, like zombies. They're obsessed with zombies, even though we don't watch any of that stuff. But it's just this picture of a woman who is walking and not experiencing that abundant life that God designed for her to be able to experience. And the reason why is because instead of her heart being ordered around God, her heart is wholly devoted to her own desires, to pleasure, Paul says. Her heart is ruled by her desire for pleasure. And here we have another one of those false anchors. You know, we've been talking about how there are so often in 1 Timothy these seemingly trustworthy anchors that appear stable, that appear sometimes even noble and virtuous, that are so enticing, particularly for women, to tie our hearts to tie our souls to. But the problem is that they prove in the end to be not stable, and they set us adrift. And so we've talked about several of those, and we see another one pop up here, but it's the false anchor in chapter 5 of pleasure. And it is a true anchor that ensnares us today. So when a woman is tied to this anchor of pleasure, she is going to chase whatever she thinks is going to make her feel good, okay? Whether it's money or love or excitement, romance, adventure, marriage, validation, affirmation, respect, relief, whatever it is that she thinks is going to make her feel good, give her relief, give her an escape, or validate her, she will pursue it. And ladies, what does our culture say? But if it feels good, then it can't be wrong, right? It must be right. If it feels good, it must be right. Our culture tells us that we are entitled to this pursuit of pleasure, that you should do whatever makes you feel good. That's why so many ladies are desperate for that ultimate epic romance, right? I mean, Romeo and Juliet, Edward and Bella from the Twilight series, just because when you engage and chase after that pleasure, you're rushing after emotions that you believe are going to be able to provide you with some sort of means of fulfillment. And ladies, that's true today. It was true in Ephesus. It was true in the Garden of Eden, that Eve saw that fruit in Genesis 3 was good for pleasure, right? It was pleasing to the eye. But we will see, particularly for the women in Ephesus, that when women attach their hearts to that anchor of pleasure, that which we still do today, that there are going to be some major repercussions. And ladies, this is not an anchor for young gals, okay? This is an anchor for women of all ages. Women who, the woman who flirts with the coworker, even if he's married, because of the thrill. I mean, we have a whole term now to describe an older woman, right, who entices and ensnares men because she is so excited about this thought of pleasure. It's the term cougar, right? That's chasing pleasure. The single woman can tie herself to this so easily by this very good desire to be married. This very good desire to have a godly husband. But what happens is if you let that rule your heart, then what happens is you chase that instead of chasing God. What about the woman who dressed immodestly? She may not actually do anything else but just dress immodestly. But it's a demonstration that in her heart, she is trying to seduce someone, that she needs to pursue pleasure because she thinks that she receives some sort of validation when men view her as desirable. And that's chasing pleasure. But it's not just a physical thing. It's not just a sexual thing. This desire to anchor our hearts to pleasure. The pursuit of pleasure can also look like the lady who binge watches TV, okay, as a means of escape. The lady who has a problem binge eating, right, as a means to feel good. The lady who binge shops. Anything that you're doing where you are so obsessed by that. If you were to boil down the anchor that we really see at play here, this anchor of pleasure in one thought, it would be this, that pleasure is about getting something that we think is going to fulfill us. Getting something, getting attention, getting validation. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Yes or no? Give me some thumbs up, give me some faces, let me know if you understand and you're tracking with what I'm saying. But it's the anchor of pleasure is about what we can get. And so a heart that is anchored to that pleasure, that desire, then she's going to do anything she needs to do in order to obtain that desire. And basically, ladies, that anchor is about a heart that is greedy. It is about greed, a heart that uses someone or uses something as a means to get what she wants, get what it wants. But when we tie ourselves to this anchor, these fleeting pursuits, ladies, this is not going to bring us happiness. It is not going to bring us fulfillment. And that's because we were created for life. We were created to be with God, who is life. And that is an eternal need that needs to be filled by someone who is eternal. And so that's why you can never just stop with one affair. You can never just stop with one pair of shoes, right? If it's binge shopping or one splurge, you can't stop with one, flirting conversation. This anchor of pleasure is a beast that always needs to be fed. And that appetite for pleasure, if our hearts are ruled by that appetite, will continually need to be fed. And that appetite will grow until it absolutely and utterly consumes us. And the life that is lived in pursuit of those types of pleasures, ultimately, Paul says, will find death. That type of pursuit brings death. Because our passions end up leading us farther and farther and farther from God, who is life. And so we are dead even as we live, Paul says. We are, instead of being ruled by our passions, we are to be blameless, Paul says in verse 7. And again, we're not supposed to be perfect, okay? That doesn't mean perfection, but rather just simply we are to have hearts that are rightly ordered, centered around God, focused on Him, ruled by Him. He is our greatest desire. Our greatest desire is to be known by Him, to know Him, to make Him known, not to be known by other men or to have other men know us and to attach our worth according to how other men view us. Ladies, that is not going to bring lasting and true fulfillment. Instead, it will bring and it will reap death. And this call for being blameless is not just for women. This is something we've heard continually in 1 Timothy, and Paul casts this to all godly leaders in the church, to elders in chapter 3, to deacons in chapter 3, to deacons' wives, and then here we see for those godly women who were to function in some sort of oversight capacity, that what makes them godly is that their heart is oriented around God. The church needs these type of women that have their heart right, who have their heart wholly devoted to Him, that continually trust in Him, and not some fleeting pleasures. Ladies, we cannot be chasing desires based on what we want to get when we have been given everything in Christ. And so a woman who has, her heart anchored to pleasure, she's going to forget what she's been given, and she is going to continually want to trade that inheritance for something else, for something fleeting, and it's going to lead to death. And so that's what Paul says that, godly women are to look like in verses 1 through 8. But then if you look at verses 9 and 10, he talks about and he spells out what godly women in the church are supposed to be doing. Let me see who else is going here. I'm going to scroll back in here. All right, I'm going to go, hey, Velvet. Hey, Amy. Lynn, hey. Oh, no, Lynn, the audio's not working. Bummer. Ladies, let me know if you're having problems hearing me. I want to make sure you can. I'm so glad you're here. Is widow interchangeable with widower in verses 3 and 4? I would have to check on that, Caroline. I'm going to say no, because I think that for the rest of this chapter, with the exception of what you see in 17 through 25, when Paul talks about just male godly leaders in the church, I believe that this is really talking in specific reference to women. Now, obviously, widowers are going to have the same, needs to have a whole heart directed toward God and all that. But I really think it's in reference to those women who were enrolled in a list in a leadership capacity. Yes, MacArthur's Study Bible says a continual state or settled action of hope in God. The MacArthur Study Bible is a great resource. In fact, I really heavily draw from the MacArthur commentaries a lot because, I may not agree with everything that he says, but I love his everyday conversational writing. And he spells everything out, and he has such a wonderful emphasis on the author's intended meaning. And he goes into the history, and he breaks down, the language. So that's a great resource. Ladies, if you want another resource to add to your library, and I'm not suggesting people binge shop, okay? But if you were to do so, then I would stick with the MacArthur Study Bible, or the MacArthur commentaries are good. Hey, Karen, yeah, nights are really hard, and I don't think those of us that have yet to experience that loss know the depth of it. I can't imagine. Yes, this type of widow has love from a pure heart, a good conscience, and a sincere faith from chapter 1. Yes, authentic faith. That's when 1 Timothy started stepping on my toes, like in verse 3, in chapter 1, 3 and 5, Caroline. It really did. Let's see what else. That's when they put Jesus sticker on it and they believe. Yes, we do that with a lot of stuff, Karen. Why do we do that? We're going to talk about that a lot in 9 and 10 and then verses 13 and onward, how we try to spiritualize things. Not good. Oh, or one concert, you gals. Hey, I hear ya. Listen, when I say things, trust me, it is not something that I am saying to you that I have not also wrestled with or struggled with. I'm kind of scared to meet Paul in heaven because he doesn't pull any punches. And, it's so interesting because when you look up Paul, he apparently, and I don't know how anybody knows this other than documents that are recorded in, church history and patriarchs of the faith, church fathers who've corresponded, but apparently Paul was a man of little stature and was not very, charismatic of a speaker, he was fiery, all right, but, but when he speaks, oh my goodness, just every single thing, it is the voice of God, obviously, because all scripture is inspired by God and profitable for teaching, but there is something about the words of Paul that are so convicting to me personally. And I don't know if, you may read another author in the scriptures like Moses or, Matthew or James. Can we not talk about James? And you may feel that way, but when I read Paul, I literally, he steps on my toes, and there are things I really have to wrestle with and that I'm still wrestling with. So ladies, that's, I'm not telling you need to be working on this stuff. This is basically stuff I've been struggling and wrestling with in myself. So All right, so I want to go on. I want to look at verses 9 and 10, and I want to talk about, what godliness looks like as it's fleshed out in our everyday lives, and what Paul was expecting these women who were added to this list, what they should be doing as well. So read with me in verses 9 and 10. He says, "Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number." And the ESV says the list. And this is why I think perhaps it's only referring to women, because this was something specifically that only women needed. A man who became a widower would then be able to have, still have his ability to do what he needed to do could obviously remarry. But for a widow, often her choices were a lot less limited. And so he says that these women need to be of a certain age, and that's because, of course, her prospects of remarriage would be none, and even greater issues of crisis and poverty. Let them be taken into the number, and not unless she has been the wife of one man. Verse 10, well reported for good works. If she has brought up children, if she has lodged strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work. So that's a really stout list, right? When I read through that the first time, I instantly thought of the Proverbs 31 woman. That woman that I refer to in the intro video to this chapter, that woman, that standard of true godliness. And what a humdinger of a list of amazing traits and qualities it is in Proverbs 31. And so it really reminds me a lot of that. There are very few women that meet that standard. There are very few women in the Ephesian church that met that standard. And, I think very often we look at a list like that and we get so overwhelmed and we think, oh, I'll never meet that standard. But I just want to be clear here and make sure that you understand what I'm saying. Paul is not inferring here that the church is only to honor and only to help or show compassion to those women who, meet the standard, okay? He's not saying we should only allow those individuals that, check, godly, got kids, you did everything right, you've lived your life, faith, blah, 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 blah. He's not saying that you ignore those that failed that standard, and we'll look why in a minute, but this is why I think he is specifying these key qualities and qualifications with respect to character, because this list, I think, brought with it leadership responsibilities. That these women were to, that were added to this list, were to offer in some way oversight over the other widows and the other orphans in the church. Because otherwise, you would obviously see the need to honor all widows, not just those that met those qualifications. So I want to look at those because, it's so interesting that Paul speaks so much about the qualifications in reference to the home and showing piety and showing godliness at home. And basically that's because that the home is a training ground for ministry. That the home is one of those places where specifically women have this opportunity to really wrestle things out and get that heart right and get that heart oriented around God in a way that a man might not. And it's not because, she's doing the dishes or, it is a very specific thing in which she has opportunities to really wrestle with some of those things that God has us wrestle with, so that we might ensure that our heart is rightly ordered. And so Paul is not saying we're only going to, take care of the women who deserve it. Oh my goodness, that is not what Paul is saying. We know that family dynamic, that principle by which we interpret this whole chapter that we got from verses 1 and 2, demands that we honor women as mothers and women as sisters. So Paul's not saying we're only going to honor those that really, make the grade. He's saying we're only going to put women into key, prominent places of leadership within the church who truly deserve it, who have, not because they've checked all the boxes, but because they have proven themselves to be faithful in their heart to God. And so in verses 9 and 10, Paul goes through and he lists some of those qualities of faithfulness. And ladies, it's not a checklist. That's not what Proverbs 31 is about even, but it is all about the heart. And so if you are if you are a woman in ministry that is a leader in your church ministering to other women, you're going to want to pay attention to this. If you are a woman who wants to be a leader but doesn't know where to start, but you really have a desire to minister to other women, you're going to want to take some notes. If you are looking for women to train up as leaders in a potential ministry in your church, you are really going to want to pay attention, because the candidates that you want to look at are those that have these specific heart qualities that Paul is going to list out. And there's 7 of them, and I'm just going to go through them real fast. Let me see. Justification, been there. Hey, Tina, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you made it. Don't worry. Better late than never, girl. Okay, so I want to go through these qualifications that he talks about in verses 9 and 10, and what they have to do to the heart and with the heart. And the first thing that Paul says is that he wants prominent women in the church to have a singular heart, meaning that they are not to have a divided heart, obviously. But you see that in verse 9 when he says that these prominent women must be the wife of one man. And we saw something very similar in chapter 3 when Paul is talking about the qualifications for godly leaders as elders and deacons. And he says, I want these men to be one woman men, meaning faithful and devoted to their wives. And so you get that same sense that that's what Paul's saying here, that even though this is a widow, that he is speaking in reference to her faithfulness to that man that was in her life. And I really I don't think that this is in reference to a woman is disqualified from leading if she's been married more than once, or that she's been, divorced, or in some respect like that. I really think it's in terms of, just like how I would interpret the qualification for the elders, that she is faithful and pure in her relationship. That she is like it says in the original language, literally, that she is a one-man woman. That she is not going to have a heart that is divided in its desires to seek attention from other men or in other places. She has a singular heart, that her heart is singularly devoted and faithful. And so that's why I say singular heart. But, listen, if all it took was being married once, I know a lot of women who've been married once, but have hearts that are rotten to the core. And so I don't really think this is about checking the box of the marriage thing. I think it's about having a singular heart, okay? No other competing desires that are at war in her heart to rule her, to have supremacy. Yes, about the heart, Kim says, these qualities show heart fixed on the hope of God. Yes, every single one of them do. That's their base. That's their basis. Okay, the second thing is, besides a singular heart, that the woman must have a servant's heart. He says in verse 10 that she must be well reported for good works. And, this isn't random acts of kindness, but this is that natural outflow of godliness that she has. And Paul will pair godliness with good works, because they go hand in hand, that when we're devoted, singularly devoted to God, it will pour out in the way in which we serve others. And it proves our heart's devotion to God. So singular heart, servant's heart, and then he says a wise heart. He says, if she has brought up children. And I do not literally think this means that Paul is saying that in order to be a leader, that this woman has to have born physical children, her own biological children. I don't think that that's saying that, because we know so many women throughout the scriptures even in real life. I think of, international missionaries. You may not know these women, but I grew up hearing about these women like Lottie Moon, who was single and who, went to China, and she was a spiritual mother to hundreds. Or Amy Carmichael, the same situation, a single missionary in India, and was loving and faithful and serving, hundreds of children. And so I think when he's talking about that she has brought up children, that he's speaking of the wisdom that comes from learning to apply your everyday life, which, for women in this culture, that would be home life, everyday life, with your faith. And I mean, okay, I am a mother, and I'm telling you that this is one of those things that I desperately need from other women, from leading women in the church, prominent women. I need this practical everyday wisdom on what godliness looks like in my home, and child rearing. Oh my goodness, like I don't even want to talk about it. That's a whole thing that I do not know about with regard to practical wisdom. And it's something, and this is why I think the age thing factors in, because with that age comes such wisdom, and knowing how and practicing how to integrate your everyday life with your faith. And so prominent leaders, women in the church, they truly must have that wise heart. And it's speaking about practical wisdom for everyday life. But also, they must have a sacrificial heart. Paul says that they must have lodged strangers. Now, just like the elders, the elders in chapter 3 were called to open their homes in hospitality, so are prominent women. And that idea of lodging strangers is more than just, opening your home, but sacrificially giving. In our culture, hospitality becomes about a lot of other things, and it could happen without being sacrificial. And I think I really learned that lesson. I see that in my parents. My parents are, just extremely sacrificial in their hospitality with us, but with everyone that they come into contact with. But I really saw that lesson at play when I moved overseas, and I lived overseas, and I saw that there were people who had nothing, but yet they would open their home to us and they would give us everything they had. And so this sacrificial type of hospitality is giving those and honoring those above yourself by giving them your best, by opening not just your home, but by opening your heart. And that's the key that Paul is really honing in. If you want to find a leader, you need to ensure that she has that sacrificial type of heart that seeks to honor others based on, the honor that she's received in Christ. So, singular heart, servant's heart, wise heart, sacrificial heart. And then we see fifth that Paul says that prominent leaders and women must have a humble heart. He says, if she has washed the feet of the saints, or the saints' feet, meaning does this woman, is she willing to perform some sort of menial task, without complaint, without grumbling? Is she willing to do so? And, in this culture, washing of feet was pretty gross. In fact, it was one of those jobs that was reserved for the lowest of the low. So that's why when Christ came and he washed the disciples' feet, there was such shock in their minds that God would have stooped, or that Christ would have stooped so low to perform in humility that menial task. Now, we don't have a lot of that going on today, but we do have changing diapers at the church nursery. Like if I had to sort of equate the two, I might choose that one. In our house, we're out of the diaper phase, but we sometimes argue over who has to poop scoop the yard. So, and that doesn't really happen without a lot of complaints. So, mom included. So I think in respect to that humble heart, is a woman willing to do those tasks that are thankless, that are not fun, that are gross? Is she willing to do them without complaint? And I think where you see a woman who only wants a public position, the easy spots, the public spots that are going to provide some sort of, satisfaction for her pleasure-seeking heart, that's a woman that you want to ensure does not get the reins of leadership in a ministry, because that is a sign of a prideful heart, and Paul says in 1 Timothy, that's really going to only bring chaos and disorder to the church. So I said I was going to zoom through this, but I keep thinking of things that I want to add to this. Do you guys do that? Singular heart, servant's heart, wise heart, sacrificial heart, humble heart, and then compassionate heart, Paul says. He says, if she has relieved the afflicted. Does a woman show compassion and mercy to those who are weak, who cannot and are unable to care for herself? It doesn't count if we're ministering to the people that look exactly like us. It doesn't count if we only minister to those people that we think are going to give us something or going to be able to provide something for us, that we think we can be able to control and manipulate for our gain. If we're only hanging out with our own friends, that is not true compassion. The true compassion is caring for those that are unable to do so. And a godly woman will do that because she will share those blessings out of her life because of the blessings that she has been shown in Christ and the compassion that Christ has shown her. Okay, so the last one is really sort of the summary point that Paul is talking about. And he says that a godly woman must have a faithful heart. That she must have a faithful heart. He says, if she has diligently followed every good work. So that word follow is a very strong word there. That word follow means and paints the picture of a woman who is intentionally following in the footsteps of another person. And to do so, she's going to have to draw very close to make sure that she does not misstep or lose the path or lose her way and get lost. And it is the picture of having a heart that is wholly devoted to God. So when those circumstances come in the middle of the night, when it's the darkest, when, the ship encounters the storm and the waves just threaten to break us up, she's not going to run off. She's not going to jump ship. She's not going to search for smoother waters. She's not going to grumble. She's not going to throw in the towel. She will be faithful. She will not jump from ministry to ministry because she gets bored, right? That's pleasure seeking. That's looking for something that affirms us. And then when it no longer affirms us, we jump ship. But a godly woman will be ultimately faithful and intentional, just like the men. Paul is concerned, with the hearts of the women, but I am always so impressed when I read through what Paul has to say. The equality in the qualifications, his standard for believers is the same. That very often, if you go through and you were to line up in a chart, the qualifications that he has for men in the church and deacons and elders, and then with women, you will see that they are very similar. And he calls them to that same standard. And that's because ultimately it is not a checklist, it's about the heart. And so it's not as if one gender has to have it all together on behalf of the other. But Paul is really concerned about godly women in the church. Sometimes we are so tempted to make leadership about external things instead of the internal things. Which is what Paul was worried about. We look at individuals and we think, oh, they would make a great leader, or they're a good leader because they're charismatic, right? They've got a winsome, charming personality, because they're professionally trained, right? That they know what they're doing. They make a good leader, right? Or because they look a certain way. We get caught in the externals of appearance. Like this person would be great to work with youth because they look real cool and look real hip and young. For women, we want speakers to come to events, or we want women to lead us that look a certain way so that they can connect. And, or even if they're married to someone who is significant, that their husband's a leader, so then, okay, they must also be, a really fabulous or wonderful leader. And listen, those are great qualities that God can use. And throughout Scripture, we see individuals that have some of those abilities, that are good speakers, that, have know-how, and he uses them. But those qualities are qualities. They aren't always necessarily qualifications. And so the two do not always go hand in hand. There's the difference. Paul is more concerned with faithfulness. Paul is more concerned with how a woman has her heart ordered and what rules her heart. And I'm just going to tell you right now, ladies, that the church needs godly women. The church is in desperate need, more so than any other time in our culture. We actually look more like ancient Ephesus, I believe, than ever before in our culture. We are in desperate need of godly women. Does that make sense, any of that? I'm going to go back here and look and see. Oh, Karen, you are the potty lady. I am not real sure I want to know what that means. The potty lady. Are you the lady that goes in and makes sure that things have been tidied up? Or what does that mean? Whatever it is, I am Girl, you got a good heart for that one. Kim, being a caregiver exposes my heart opportunities to keep my hope fixed on him. It is, and you know, I've been following your story a little bit, and I know that has been a struggle that God has uniquely equipped you for. I know He has, because I've seen your heart in action, and I think your mother is such a blessed lady, Kim. All right, let me see. Karen, I understand where you're coming from, Kim. Yes, y'all encourage one another. I love this when I see that. You guys, I want this to be a community. Haha, take them to the potty in the Wahoo. For those of you that are wondering, what's a Wahoo? The Wahoo is the nursery in the kids area at our church. We call it the Big Wahoo. You know, that just sounds fun, right? You want the kids, when they're coming in to visit, to think this is going to be a fun experience, so mom and dad can hear about Jesus, right? Okay. So let's keep going on. I am interested to see if this has ever, you guys have ever felt this way, because, you know, as I was going through this list for what true qualifications look like for leadership, you know, I love ministering to women, and so there are times where I have to do true heart checks to make sure that my heart, that there is no false anchor that's popped up there. But sometimes I struggle with confusing those qualities versus true qualifications, meaning qualities versus true faithfulness. And I really was convicted of that recently. So tell me if that's something that you struggle with too. Give me some thumbs up, or tell me what specifically. But recently, someone at my church here in Chattanooga invited me to attend a youth event. They were having a big youth ministry event, and we have a fabulous youth ministry at our church. And so they invited me to come. And ladies, immediately, without batting an eyelash, I said no. I said, oh no, I don't think I'm cool enough, you know, which I'm not. But like, that was my first response. I really tend, on the spectrum of coolness, I tend toward the church lady side. I think, God obviously in His sovereignty know when He was to have me be born, but I kind of feel like sometimes I don't fit in my generation. I feel like I'm a bit of a modern and crammed into a postmodern body. That's a little bit, schizophrenic, but you know what I'm saying? Like I definitely am not on the cool end of the spectrum. But when I was invited to attend, and just to attend, they weren't even asking me to do anything. I just said no. Oh, I'm not cool enough. And so when I was going through and I was looking at those qualities for a leader, I was really convicted about that, because so often we will shut down opportunities to serve, or opportunities to speak into the life of another woman, because we believe that we're not qualified. And our belief is based on, our qualities. We think because we're not professionally trained, or because we don't know what we're doing. And listen, half the time, I don't know what I'm doing. I just say, okay, God, you're just going to have to do it. I'm just going to show up. But sometimes we get those mixed up in our brain, and we think that those qualities are what really qualify us to be leaders. And that's just not what Paul is saying. And so when I've been going through 1 Timothy, that's been a point of really looking at my heart on that one. Do you guys ever feel that way? Julie, hey Julie, our youth, yes, they are incredible. Oh, they would love you. See, now I can't say no. Don't tell our youth minister. Okay, so I want to keep going, because Paul tells us in the next section, not only do we need godly women in the church, but we need godly homes. That we really and truly need not just godly women, but we need godly homes. So look with me at verses 11 through 16. And in case you're just now tuning in, I'm not going to delve a lot at the end of the chapter. So in case you were worried about time, this is where I've really been camping out. So just want to let you know in case you were kind of looking at the clock. But I want to read, and I want to look at what God says about the need for, or Paul says about the need for godly homes in the life of the church, okay? Read with me in verse 11. He says, and I'm going to read this entire section, okay, because I want you to hear it read, and I want you to be able to treat it as an entire section. But Paul says this, he says, but refuse the younger widows. And we'll talk about what that means. Refuse the younger widows. For when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry, having condemnation because they have cast off from their first faith. Verse 13, look at that. He says, and besides, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. Verse 14, therefore I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity for the adversary to speak reproachfully. Verse 15, for some have already turned aside to Satan, Paul says. Verse 16, if any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them. And do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. And so what Paul is saying here, when he says refuse the younger widows, he is not saying, okay, we're not going to add younger women to this list because, you know, we have this checklist, right? We've got this checklist and they've got to meet all these markers. But what he is saying, refuse these women, meaning don't add them to this position of leadership, this prominent position where they will be given oversight. And the reason is because, as we'll find out, because of their hearts. Their hearts toward their home were not where they needed to be. They had divided hearts. Look at this what's going on in their hearts, because Paul's going to lay out this progression of sin that happens in the life of these women. And ladies, this sin did not happen overnight, okay? This is a very clear progression. And it manifests itself in a very specific way in Ephesus, in the women there. But ladies, it still works the same way today, okay? This is why in your study sheets, if you have been digging deeper, I asked you specifically to try to decipher what this progression looked like, okay? So we're going to walk through that together. Look at verse 11. The progression of sin in the women in Ephesus, it starts in their heart. Sin always starts in our hearts, ladies. It starts with those desires and those passions that, you know, that seek to control us rather than letting our hearts be controlled by Christ. And ladies, that's the definition of an idol. Pursuing something or someone over Christ, so much so that it begins to control you. And for these women, it looked like, he says in verse 11, growing wanton against Christ. Or the ESV is a little bit clearer. It says passions that draw them away from Christ. So to grow wanton is basically to have sexual desires. These women were being overtly sexual in the pursuit of their hearts. And they desired in such a way, and things that forced them to, or not forced, but enticed them to tie their heart to that false anchor of pleasure. That's what this looks like, and it starts in their heart. They were focused on getting, and they were focused on getting a husband. They wanted to marry. And listen, that's a good desire. That's a godly desire. But when a good desire becomes a controlling desire in our heart, it becomes an idol. And so Paul is saying that these women, because of these desires that they had elevated to the wrong position in their heart, they had a divided heart then. And so Paul is saying, refuse them. We do not want them elevated to a prominent position in leadership because they were so focused on getting a husband. Ladies, this is a hard one because I counsel women all the time who have this good desire. It starts out as a good desire to be married to a godly man. And what happens is that desire consumes them, and that desire changes and influences and determines the way they act, the way they talk, the way they walk, where they go, what they spend their money on, what they spend their thought life on, what they invest in, who they hang out with. Their desire controls them, and they are obsessed with getting this desire. But ladies, it starts in the heart. And that's with any sin. It starts in the heart. And then Paul says this progression leads them, look at verse 12, to unanchor themselves from faith. And I apparently just discovered that unanchor is not a word. I don't know if Amanda, you're still on here, but spell check won't ever let me say unanchor. But I desperately want it to be a word. Can we just make it a word for this study? Okay. So sin is going to start in our heart, but it's going to lead us to unanchor ourselves from our faith. And he says that in verse 12. He says, they incur condemnation because they have cast off, Paul says, from their first faith. So instead of, a godly woman who is going to trust in God, hope in him continually every single day, despite her circumstances, she's going to trust that God alone is going to fulfill her, is going to satisfy her. These women instead were unanchoring themselves from Christ, and they were anchoring themselves to pleasure. And what was happening is they were throwing off their responsibilities to be women in pursuit of good works that call for godliness within the church. And so very likely these younger women, when they were added to the list or when they were enrolled in this financial support, I'm assuming that probably there was some sort of a pledge or a commitment that they had to make on their end, that they would contribute to the good work of the church in some way. And so their sin, though, was leading them with a divided heart to neglect that pledge that they had made, that covenant, if you will. And so instead of being busy with good works, they were casting off from that. They were unanchoring from that. So then the progression continues, and you see, hey, Amanda, unanchor is officially a word now. It is, because Amanda said it, and she is the word guru. She is. She does it for a living, so it's got to be true. Thank you. You saved me from being stressed out, Amanda. Okay, so the progression continues. It goes from the heart, and then it goes to manifest in our behavior. And then I want you to look at what happens next, because sin then will move, and it will set us adrift because we're unanchored now, but it will set us adrift in dangerous waters. Look at verse 13. Paul says that they were idle, no longer doing what they should be doing, rendering good works, okay? Instead, what these women were doing were they were set adrift. They were wandering around. They were literally going from house to house, and that word wander means like a navigator, just walking on a circuit. And so these women, instead of following closely with Christ, following closely in his footsteps with his good example faithfully, they were just walking in a circle, just useless. And their time was spent up with useless activities. They were gossiping. And gossiping is such an interesting word too in the original language. It means to literally to boil up. And it shows, demonstrates this picture of like bubbles coming up and then popping. And so when we engage in gossip, it's a useless activity, like a bubble. It's a useless thing. We don't need to be doing it. It's actually a flag of a false anchor, that false anchor of pleasure. Because we think that in gossiping, we're giving full vent to the desires of our heart. And so we think that it's going to provide us with some sort of pleasure, to tear someone down so that we can feel better. And Paul says that these women were gossiping, they were busybodies, they were meddling, they were doing things, saying things in which they ought not. And the harm in this is that it sets us adrift in dangerous waters. It gives the enemy a foothold in our life from which he can lob attacks at us. And those footholds never stay as footholds. They always become strongholds. And then the final step in this progression of sin is that it anchors us to Satan. That we become, because of these strongholds, enslaved to Satan. Look at verse 15. This is the final step in this progression of sin. Paul says, verse 15, "For some have already turned aside to Satan," he says. So instead of following in Christ's footsteps, now we're following in Satan's footsteps. And I'm not trying to be dramatic here or overstate this, but this is what Paul is saying. That we are, instead of serving the church, instead of serving Christ, we are enslaved. We are in captivity to Satan's schemes, and we are anchored to the devil. Ladies, there is hardly a woman who is trapped by Satan overnight, okay? She does not just wake up one day and have shackles on her wrists. That this is something that takes place, a progression over time, but it always starts in the heart, and I promise you, it always leads to our spiritual death. We've talked a lot, not a lot, but some, about the Proverbs 31 woman. and how she has a heart for God first, and then that spills out into her heart for others. But there's another woman that's featured in the book of Proverbs. And we don't really talk about this lady, okay? But we should, okay? This is the Proverbs 7 lady. Do you guys know who I'm talking about? This is the Proverbs 7 lady. And let me tell you, she is the exact opposite of the Proverbs 31 woman. The Proverbs 31 woman is self-controlled, okay? She is self-controlled. The Proverbs 7 woman is self-indulgent. Oh, she's controlled all right, but not by herself, but by her desires. And I won't read Proverbs 7 for time, but I want to challenge you this week to read Proverbs 7. In fact, I'd hoped to give you another challenge, but I didn't want to overwhelm you because I know some of you have said you're kind of behind. But if you really wanted to delve into what true godliness looks like and what it does not look like, what a great exercise it would be to read Proverbs 31 and make a list of all those amazing qualities, and then side by side make a list of what you see in the life of the woman in Proverbs 7. This woman is described as an immoral woman, and Solomon is writing to his son, and he is warning his son against this immoral woman. And these are just a few descriptions that I pulled to give you an idea about what he's talking about. This woman who has anchored her heart to pleasure. And you see the progression of sin in her life. But this is just a little bit. She is a seductress. She flatters with words. She dresses like a harlot. So she's not a harlot. She's not a prostitute, but she just dresses like one. She has a crafty heart. She is loud and rebellious. So she's attention driven and attention seeking. Her feet would not stay at home. And that doesn't mean you're not supposed to work outside the home, okay? Because look at the Proverbs 31 woman. But it's that her heart was so divided, she was constantly seeking an escape from home. And we know godliness is such an opportunity. There's such an opportunity to practice that in the home. This lady, her feet would not stay at home. She lurks around every corner like, a prey, like she's stalking her prey, setting traps for men. She engages in sexual activity with married men, and she is married herself. She is what Solomon is warning his son against a woman who has a heart anchored to pleasure. And one person that I read really brought this out, one author really brought this out, and I so appreciated this, that this everyday woman, this woman in Proverbs 7 is not a prostitute. She sounds like one, but she's not. She's an everyday woman. She is a church lady. If you read through Proverbs 7, it says she goes to the church and she offers her sacrifice and she pays her vows and she does her duties. She does her checklist, okay? But she is not the Proverbs 31 woman because she doesn't have the same heart. She is the everyday woman. She is a church lady. This is, not something that you can say, I'm never going to struggle with this anchor. That's not going to be me. I'm not going to find myself on a street corner downtown soliciting men. No, this is an everyday woman. She's a pleasure seeker. And this is the way Solomon ends his warning to his son about this woman. Listen to what he says. He says, don't stray into her paths. He says, she has cast down strong men. And this is what I really want you to focus on. He says this in 7 verse 27. He says, her house is the way to hell. Her house is the way to hell. It sounds pleasant. Descending to the chambers of death. Ladies, the anchor of pleasure leads to death, just like Paul says. Solomon knew it. It was a hard lesson Solomon learned. And Paul is telling us that too. But the terrifying thing is that could be any one of us. That could be any one of our homes that is described in that way. The chambers of death. That our house is the way to hell. Y'all, okay, can we just talk about something for a second? Because every time when I open up the news these days or I open up Facebook, y'all, I see a story about a teacher, a high school teacher, who has seduced, acted like the Proverbs 7 woman with one of her students. Y'all, what is going on? Every day this week I've heard one of these stories or read one of these stories. And these women who are engaging in these activities and seducing these men, these young boys, they're students in high school, they're not like 20-year-old grad students, okay? These women are of all ages, young and old. I read an article the day before yesterday about a woman in Georgia who was 50 years old who had fallen into this anchor of pleasure, and she had entrapped a student, and then she blamed it on the student. I am telling you, listen, these women are caught in their own traps, and I am shocked by the number of these stories that have come up. Listen, this is the reality that we live in. This is the reality that we live in. It is so commonplace. You turn on TV and, I mean, this is the plot line. It is about the older cougars enticing and attracting these men because of the lie that the pursuit of pleasure will bring us fulfillment. But it's just not the case. Ladies, this home could be our home, okay? This woman could be us. And so Paul is saying godliness in the home matters. It matters because our homes are going to reflect our hearts. And that's why I really wanted you to ask yourself that question as you were reading. Why does godliness matter in my home? You know, I can see why it matters in the church, but why does it matter in my home? And Paul's just saying here in these verses that our homes are reflections of our hearts and our heart's true desire. The Proverbs 7 woman's home reflected her heart. The home of the Proverbs 31 woman reflected her heart. The homes of the women in Ephesians, their homes reflected their hearts. And so do ours today too. The church desperately needs godly women. The church desperately needs godly homes. And listen, if we lack those things, if the church lacks those things, it will do great harm to the church's ability to be able to fulfill its mission the way that it is supposed to. This anchor is a very big deal. But this is what I love. Paul does not kick these women out. He does not sideline them. He doesn't say, okay, you've missed the grade, you've messed up, you're out of here. But he specifically repositions them so that they might learn and be retrained in their heart to orient their heart wholly to God. Look at what he says in verse 14. He says, therefore, I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity for the adversary to speak reproachfully. And this is where we've got to remember that framework that we talked about in verses 1 and 2. Because without that, if we just read this one verse, we may get a little offended, a little miffed, because our culture says that women can do it all. We don't need to worry about the home, that's unnecessary. But we know that's not true. We know the home is necessary to the work of the church, primarily because the church and the home were so intimately intertwined. But this is not, Paul is not saying that a woman's place is barefoot, pregnant, and in the kitchen. Okay, you got to read the whole book of 1 Timothy, all right? I'm not even going to talk about that one. That is just so ridiculous. He's not saying that women are to be treated like Cinderella, okay? Wash the floors, scrub the dishes, whatever. He is not saying, that you've got to be the Proverbs 31 woman either. He's not saying you got to meet the checklist. You got to do all this stuff, do that, and that's true godliness. But what Paul is after is the heart, and our homes reflect our hearts. And as women, we have this very high calling to be able to participate in the work of the church as we are learning and practicing godliness in our homes. The home is not a woman's highest calling, and I want to be clear about that too. Because we can turn our homes into an idol just as much as the search for pleasure. Everything with Pinterest, we could talk about that forever. But what Paul is after is the heart. That he wants the home to be able to truly reflect a heart that is wholly and singularly devoted to God. And so he is allowing these younger women the opportunity to be able to retrain their hearts towards Christ, their desires towards Christ, to allow their conduct and their character to mirror him. And he gives them that practical space for them to be able to do that. So they can learn those 7 heart qualities that he outlined in verses 9 and 10, okay? So when you are thinking about godliness in the home, our standard is not Martha Stewart, okay? Because didn't she go to jail? It's not Martha Stewart. It's not, Chip and Joanna Gaines, as much as I hate to say that because I love myself some Chipper and Joanna. That's not our standard. Our standard is not even the Proverbs 31 woman, as wonderful as she is. Our standard, our goal is Christ, is Christ-likeness. And we have to be careful in our pursuit of pleasure that we do not do the opposite of elevating, becoming the ideal mother, the ideal woman, to this standard in which we now are going to do everything we can in order to make that goal come to fruition in our life. That's chasing the anchor of pleasure just as much as the woman who is enticing men who are married to come home with her. That's not what we want. We want to focus on the heart and the heart's desire. And so that's why Paul spends so much time speaking about honoring women, making sure they have a space, making sure they have a place to come to the table and participate in the work of the church in ways in which are going to benefit the church immensely. And so that's what I really want you to take away from tonight. And I'm not going to go over verses 17 through 25 where it talks about male leadership. There are some good things there, especially with respect to ensuring that there are not men who are unaccountable, who set themselves up as like a pastor king, because in those situations, women do become oppressed. And so I'm so appreciative for Paul for making sure, first of all, that he is equal in his admonitions for men and women in the church, because men and women are vitally important, both. But I'm also appreciative that he sets out some standards for male leaders to ensure that everyone in the church, every member of the family is honored in which they are to be honored. So this week, if you have questions about verses 17 through 25, just post them and I will respond to them. But I don't want to go over those and spend the time to do that. But for my ladies that like to buy books, and we're not talking about binge buying books, okay? We're not going to, that's one thing I think it's okay. No, I'm just kidding. So if you want another book to add to your arsenal, I have a great, fabulous book. In fact, if I have a friend who has a daughter, this is a book I would recommend to her as a must read. A must read, okay? I want to make sure you can see it. I'm sure it's going to be flipped, but I'll give you the title. But this is the book, and it's by an author named Mary Cassian, and it's called Girls Gone Wise, Girls Gone Wise in a World Gone Wild. Mary Cassian, and Cassian is spelled Kassian, Girls Gone Wise in a World Gone Wild. And she, in this whole book, she goes through the Proverbs 31 woman, and then she goes through the Proverbs 7 woman. In fact, she talks more about the Proverbs 7 woman than anything else. And she draws out from the heart those qualities that truly are there, that are so devastating and that we need to be watchful for. So that book, if you have a daughter, you need to get this. You need to buy this book. You must. And you need to probably go through it with your daughter. And I would say an older daughter because of the nature of what's in Proverbs 7. I would say probably high school. But I'll leave that to you. A fabulous book. Read that book. And if you want this weekend, go through and look at Proverbs 31 and look at Proverbs 7. And see what insights you can find. Julie, yes. You know what, Julie? You need to get that book. Actually, if you want to borrow mine, I'll let you borrow it so you don't get into trouble. Okay. Let me see what else. Caroline, I know. Heart and home. It is a struggle. That's why I said I can't sit here and say you need to be doing this, because these are things that I have struggled with as I've gone through this book, trying to figure out how to get that practical wisdom that I need to get my heart right. Oh, Kim, I love you, ladies. Okay, bedtime, I hear you. All right, I know you guys have bedtime with kiddos and other things going on. I'm so thankful for you. I hope you have a wonderful week. Next week is our final week in the study. Finish strong, ladies. Do all of your reading that you can do, and I love you so much. Yes, a good recommendation for your daughter who's a high schooler. Yes, Karen, it would be fabulous, but I would recommend that you read it together and that you talk about it together, okay? I think it would be more meaningful. All right, ladies, I am proud of you, and I'll see you soon.